There is a pattern to how great powers justify wars that history has documented with uncomfortable precision. The pattern does not begin with the first bomb. It begins with the last negotiating room and with the careful management of what the public is permitted to know about what happened inside it. The justification for war is almost never the truth of the final diplomatic exchange. It is a simplified version of that truth, edited to produce a specific conclusion, that the other side was unreasonable, that every option had been exhausted, that there was no path left except force. History, when it is allowed to examine the actual record, almost always tells a more complicated story. On February 26, 2026, two delegations sat in separate rooms in Geneva, communicating through Omani mediators in what Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi described as one of the most serious and longest rounds of indirect negotiations Iran had ever conducted. The United States was represented by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Iran's proposals had been delivered in writing the night before. The IAEA's Director General was in the building. A second carrier strike group was already moving toward the region. Everyone in that building understood that what happened in those rooms over the next several hours would determine whether the Middle East went to war. 48 hours later, the bombs were falling on Tehran. The official narrative that emerged in the hours and days following the strikes was carefully constructed. Iran had been unreasonable. Iran had rejected every offer. Iran had insisted on nuclear weapons capability and refused to negotiate in good faith. Steve Witkoff, in the aftermath, said the Iranians had tried to strong-arm the American team and had even boasted about having deceived international monitors. The story told to the public was one of Iranian intransigence in the face of reasonable American demands. It was a story designed to produce consent. And like most stories designed to produce consent, it left out the parts that complicated the conclusion. What the United States actually demanded in Geneva has since emerged from multiple sources. The American position, as presented by Witkoff and Kushner, required Iran to destroy its three primary nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. It required Iran to transfer all remaining enriched uranium to the United States. It required any new nuclear agreement to last indefinitely, with no sunset clauses of any kind. And it required a complete permanent halt to all uranium enrichment on Iranian soil. These were not negotiating positions designed to produce a deal. They were demands for total capitulation from a country that had been developing nuclear infrastructure for 4 decades, and that had survived sanctions, cyber warfare, assassinations of its scientists, and 2 rounds of direct military strikes on its facilities. Iran's actual proposals in Geneva have been less prominently reported, but they are documented. Tehran offered to reduce its uranium enrichment from 60% to 1.5%. It offered a temporary suspension of enrichment for multiple years. It offered to dilute part of its enriched uranium stockpile under IAEA supervision. It proposed an Arab-Iranian consortium to process uranium within Iran under international oversight. It offered Iranian oil and gas access to the American market. It offered Iranian purchases of American aircraft. The Iranian official who spoke to Al Jazeera during the talks described the proposal as politically serious, technically creative, and containing everything required to reach an agreement immediately. The Omani mediator, after the talks, described significant progress. These are not the descriptions of a side that refused to negotiate. The distance between what was offered and what was demanded is the most important fact about what happened in Geneva. And understanding that distance requires understanding something about the history of negotiations that precede wars that were not actually unavoidable. The pattern is not new. In the months before the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the Iraqi government submitted a 12,000-page declaration to the United Nations detailing its weapons programs. Weapons inspectors were operating inside the country. The inspection process was producing results. The administration had already decided on war and needed the diplomatic process to fail, not to succeed. The inspectors were pulled out. The invasion followed. The weapons of mass destruction that justified it were never found. In 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident provided the justification for the escalation of American military involvement in Vietnam. What actually happened in those waters on the night of August 4th was not what was told to Congress the following morning. The fabricated or exaggerated attack provided the legislative authorization for a war that killed more than 50,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese. The Pentagon Papers, when they were finally published, showed that the administration had been planning the escalation regardless of what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. The incident was the justification, not the cause. These are not obscure examples. They are the most studied cases in the modern history of the relationship between diplomatic failure and military action. What makes Geneva different from previous cases is the specific quality of the documentation. The talks were mediated by a third party whose foreign minister publicly described significant progress. Iran's proposals were delivered in writing and partially published. Multiple sources from both the American and Iranian sides have subsequently described what was discussed. The IAEA's Director General was present, and critically, the timeline between the end of the talks and the beginning of the strikes was 48 hours, not weeks, not a period during which technical discussions in Vienna could produce a result. 48 hours. The strikes had been prepared before the talks concluded. The decision had been made before the negotiators reported back. History has a specific term for diplomatic processes that are conducted while the military action they are supposed to prevent has already been decided. The term is theater. It does not mean the diplomats were insincere. Aragchi was clearly sincere. The Omani mediator was clearly sincere. Even elements of the American delegation may have believed they were conducting genuine negotiations, but the decision to strike was made at a level above the negotiating room, by people who had concluded that the outcome they wanted could not be achieved through diplomacy and that the diplomatic process needed to run its course publicly before the military option could be politically justified. This is not a conspiracy. It is the documented operation of how great power decision-making works when the strategic objective is incompatible with a negotiated outcome. The strategic objective in this case was not, despite the public framing, the prevention of Iranian nuclear weapons. The IAEA had confirmed that Iran was not currently enriching uranium. American intelligence agencies had assessed that Iran had not restarted a weapons program. The June 2025 strikes had significantly degraded Iran's nuclear infrastructure. The actual enriched uranium stockpile that remained was large enough to be concerning in theory, but was under international monitoring. Iran's offer in Geneva to reduce enrichment to 1.5% under IAEA supervision would have addressed every verifiable nuclear concern that the United States had publicly articulated. The demand for permanent zero enrichment, the dismantling of all facilities, and the transfer of all material to American custody went far beyond what any sovereign state that had not been militarily defeated could accept. The demands were designed to be rejected. This is where the historical pattern becomes most clearly visible. When a dominant power has decided that regime change is the actual objective and nuclear nonproliferation is the stated objective, the negotiating positions tend to reflect the actual objective rather than the stated one. Iraq in 2003 could not prove the absence of weapons it did not have. Iran in 2026 could not meet demands that required the elimination of its sovereign capacity for nuclear technology. In both cases, the gap between what was publicly demanded and what could realistically be agreed was not a function of negotiating difficulty. It was a function of the fact that agreement was not the goal. What history records in these moments is not the failure of diplomacy. It records the use of diplomacy as preparation for war. There is a specific quality to the silence that follows a failed negotiation that preceded a war. It is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of managed information. The Oman foreign minister's statement about significant progress was carefully noted in some outlets and quietly passed over in others. Iran's written proposals, described by Iranian officials as politically serious and technically creative, were never published in full by any Western government. The American demands: destroy 3 nuclear sites, transfer all enriched. Uranium, accept permanent zero enrichment with no sunset clauses, were reported initially in the Wall Street Journal based on unnamed officials and received a fraction of the coverage given to the strikes themselves. The architecture of public understanding was built after the decisions were made, not before them. What the historical record consistently shows about moments like this is that the management of public understanding is not incidental to the decision to go to war. It is structural. The 1964 Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed 98-2 in the Senate based on an incident that the administration knew had not occurred as described: the 2003 Iraq War. Authorization passed with broad bipartisan support based on intelligence assessments that key figures in the administration already had reason to doubt. In both cases, the management of public information was not a secondary consideration. It was the enabling condition for the action. Wars that lack a justification the public finds credible do not begin. The justification must be constructed before the action can proceed. Geneva, in this reading, was not the final attempt to avoid a war. It was the final piece of the justification for one. The structural question that history asks of these moments is not whether the war could have been avoided. Wars of this kind are almost always technically avoidable at the moment of decision. The structural question is why the decision to avoid them was not made, and who benefited from the decision that was made instead. In the case of Geneva, the parties who could not accept a negotiated outcome that preserved Iranian sovereign nuclear capacity were not difficult to identify. They had been publicly identified for years. The Israeli government's position that any Iranian enrichment capacity constituted an existential threat had been articulated in the highest possible diplomatic forms for more than a decade. The Trump administration's most hawkish advisors had spent years arguing that regime change in Iran was both achievable and necessary. The military assets were already in position. The decision had already been taken. Geneva was the last public step in a sequence that had been privately concluded before it began. The people who understand this pattern before it becomes historical consensus are not the people who listen to press conferences. They are the people who understand that the gap between what is said in a negotiating room and what is told to the public about what was said in that negotiating room is one of the most reliable indicators of whether a power is actually seeking an agreement or performing the search for one. The performance is always convincing enough to produce the necessary consent. It has to be. Without consent, the action cannot proceed. And the consent is always manufactured from the same material, a simplified narrative of unreasonable opponents, exhausted options, and a reluctant decision, forced by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The circumstances are never as beyond control as they are presented. The decision is never as reluctant as it is described, and the options are never as exhausted as the official account requires. Geneva was one more chapter in a story that monetary and military historians have been reading for a very long time. The chapter always ends the same way. The costs are always distributed to people who were not in the room. The cost of that gap is never borne only by the parties to the conflict. The Strait of Hormuz has been effectively closed since the strikes began. Qatar has halted LNG production. Oil prices have surged. Insurance markets for the entire Gulf region have seized. The fiscal consequences are now transmitting through every economy whose industrial base depends on energy inputs that passed through that corridor. The 48 hours between Geneva and the first strike will eventually be recognized as one of the most consequential diplomatic failures in the history of the modern Middle East, not because a deal was impossible, but because the historical record, examined carefully, suggests a deal was available and that the decision to pursue a different outcome was made before the negotiators sat down. Empires have made this calculation before. The cost, then as now, was never paid by the people who made it.